At the turn of the 20th century, respectability could be lost faster than it was earned. At the beginning of the 1900s, England was a society still governed by appearance, reputation, and rigid social order. Class distinctions were closely observed, and a woman's standing could determine not only how she lived, but how she was judged. It is within this environment that the story of Kitty Byron begins. Born Emma Byron, and later known to most as Kitty, she was raised in circumstances considered respectable for the time. Her family lived within modest comfort, and her early life followed a predictable course shaped by stability and routine. Those who knew her described nothing unusual about her upbringing. She was well presented, neatly dressed, and accustomed to moving within respectable surroundings. That stability began to erode following the death of her father. With his passing came an immediate change in the family's circumstances. The financial security that had once supported them was no longer assured, and practical decisions replaced long-held expectations. The move away from her earlier environment was not sudden, but it was decisive. Kitty relocated eastward and found work in dressmaking, a trade that offered independence but little security. The work was demanding, the hours irregular, and advancement uncertain. There was no dramatic fall, no single turning point, only a gradual narrowing of options. By the time the new century was fully underway, the foundations of her earlier life had already begun to give way. Tonight, we examine the case of Kitty Byron, a young woman whose name became fixed in the public record after one afternoon in London altered everything that came before it. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. And if you find these documented stories of history compelling, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. This is not a story told through rumor or speculation. It unfolds through dates, witnesses, and official decisions, step by step, exactly as it did more than a century ago. The relationship did not begin with conflict. It began with attention. Arthur Reginald Baker was older than Kitty Byron by more than 2 decades. Born in 1857, he belonged to a different social and personal world, shaped by education, experience, and a confidence that came with age. He was well-spoken, outwardly polished, and familiar with the expectations of respectable society. To those who encountered him, he appeared composed and assured. At the time he met Kitty, Baker was a married man, though his marriage had already broken down. By early 1902, he was living apart from his wife, a separation that existed in practice before it was formalized. It was during this period that his association with Kitty became closer and more frequent. Their relationship developed gradually. They spent increasing amounts of time together, moving within the same social spaces and sharing daily routines. To Kitty, Baker's attention carried weight. He represented stability, experience, and a sense of protection that her own circumstances no longer offered. The imbalance was subtle but present from the outset. There was no immediate sign of disorder or instability. Instead, a quiet dependency began to form. Kitty's choices, movements, and expectations increasingly revolved around the relationship. What had once been a life defined by cautious independence slowly began to shift. By the time their lives became fully intertwined, the direction of her future was no longer entirely her own. Some addresses become central to a case not because of what happens there, but because of who is watching. By the middle of 1902, Kitty Byron and Arthur Reginald Baker were living together in rented rooms at 18 Duke Street, St. James's, an address situated close to the centre of London's commercial life. The rooms were part of a shared household overseen by the landlady, Madame Edwardian London, a French widow who expected order and respectability from those who lived under her roof. The arrangement was not private. Other occupants moved through the house daily, including domestic staff, and little escaped notice. Madame Led later recalled that she had believed the couple to be living as husband and wife, an assumption shaped by their manner and presentation rather than any formal declaration. Respectability, as she understood it, depended as much on appearances as on fact. Over time, the atmosphere within the rooms began to change. Raised voices were heard more frequently, and moments of unease became difficult to ignore. While nothing outwardly dramatic occurred, the sense that the situation was unsettled grew steadily. What had once been a place of shared routine became a space of observation. The walls were thin, movements were noted, and concerns were quietly formed. The room on Duke Street was no longer simply where they lived. It was where their private difficulties became visible to others, and where the first formal impressions of their relationship were shaped. What followed was not sudden, but it was noticed. As the months progressed, the arrangement at Duke Street became increasingly strained. Financial pressure began to surface, and Kitty's employment grew uncertain. The irregular hours demanded by dressmaking left little margin for stability, and her absences were remarked upon. Within the household, arguments were heard more often, their tone sharper than before. Those who lived and worked in the house later described a change in Arthur Reginald Baker's behavior, particularly when he had been drinking. At such times, his manner was said to shift noticeably, becoming unpredictable and difficult to manage. These episodes were not constant, but when they occurred, they were remembered. Kitty's distress during this period was visible. She was observed in a state of agitation on more than one occasion, and her anxiety became apparent to others sharing the residence. What had once appeared as a balanced domestic arrangement now gave rise to concern. Madame Adrienne Led, responsible for maintaining order within the house, began to take closer notice of what was unfolding. The raised voices and repeated disturbances suggested that the situation was no longer contained. While no single incident marked a breaking point, the accumulation of these observations led to a clear conclusion. The relationship had moved beyond quiet imbalance. It was now approaching a point where private difficulty would invite formal response. Once the notice was given, time began to narrow instead of moving forward. On the 4th of November 1902, divorce papers were formally served on Arthur Reginald Baker. The petition named Kitty Byron as co-respondent, placing her position beyond private dispute and into official record. Within the household at Duke Street, the effect was immediate. Tension that had been contained now became visible, and the atmosphere shifted from unease to urgency. Later that week, a disturbance drew attention from others in the house. Voices were raised, and Kitty was seen outside the room in a state of distress. The incident was noted at the time and later recalled in court, not for its drama, but for what it revealed about the condition of the relationship. Madame Adrienne Led intervened and instructed that the arrangement could not continue. Kitty was told she must leave. She asked for additional time, explaining that she had nowhere else to go and expressing fear about what might follow. She referred to Baker's behavior and spoke of the possibility of harm if matters were forced too quickly. Her concern was not dismissed, but neither did it alter the decision. After consideration, a single week was granted. It was intended as a practical allowance, not a resolution. From that point onward, each remaining day was counted, and the course of events became fixed within a narrowing frame. The city was already crowded before anything unusual occurred. Monday, 10th of November 1902, began as a public occasion. London was hosting the annual Lord Mayor's Show, an event that drew large crowds into the streets of the city. Traffic moved slowly, pavements were filled, and police were deployed in greater numbers to manage the flow of people. The conditions of the day would later become relevant, not for ceremony, but for delay. That morning, Kitty Byron moved through central London on her own. Her movements were later reconstructed through receipts, witnesses, and official accounts. She visited a shop in Oxford Street, where a small purchase was made. From there, she continued eastward toward the city. Later, she entered a post office in Lombard Street and arranged for a message to be delivered. The wording was brief and direct, requesting a meeting later that afternoon. A young messenger was assigned to the delivery, but progress was slowed by the crowds associated with the procession. The streets were congested, and movement through the area was difficult. The delay was noted. The message was eventually delivered, and the arrangement was set in motion. A time and place were understood, shaped by circumstance rather than precision. By early afternoon, the city remained busy, unaware that the final steps of the case had already been quietly completed. The meeting took place in full view of the public. During the afternoon of the 10th of November 1902, Arthur Reginald Baker arrived in the city following receipt of the message sent earlier that day. The meeting point was on King William Street, a busy thoroughfare already crowded due to the Lord Mayor's show. Passers-by later recalled seeing the two speak briefly near the entrance to a building, their exchange drawing little attention at first. Witnesses described a short disagreement. The conversation appeared tense, but not prolonged. What followed occurred quickly and without warning to those nearby. Several members of the public reacted immediately, calling for assistance and moving toward the pair. Within moments, the situation had drawn a small crowd. Police officers who were already on duty nearby reached the scene and took control. Kitty Byron was restrained and taken into custody. Arthur Reginald Baker was attended to at the location before being placed in an ambulance for transport to St. Bartholomew's Hospital. The journey did not end in recovery. Baker was pronounced dead before arrival at the hospital. The street was cleared, and those who had witnessed the incident were asked to remain to give their accounts. By late afternoon, King William Street had returned to its ordinary flow of traffic and pedestrians. What remained was no longer a public disturbance, but the opening record of a criminal case. What followed was not decided at the street, but at the station. After the incident on King William Street, Kitty Byron was taken into police custody without delay. The immediate focus shifted from public observation to formal procedure. At the station, her condition and words were recorded as part of the official process, marking the transition from event to investigation. Her first statement was given soon after arrival. In it, she acknowledged her actions directly, offering an account that was entered into the record without alteration. The wording was noted carefully by officers, as was her manner at the time. This initial account would later become a central reference point in the case. At a later stage, Kitty provided a further explanation. In this second statement, she addressed the question of intent, offering clarification that differed in emphasis from her first account. Both statements were preserved in full, neither replacing the other. Instead, they were retained side by side, allowing the sequence in which they were given to speak for itself. News of the incident began to circulate quickly. Interest formed beyond those who had witnessed the scene, and attention turned toward the forthcoming legal process. Arrangements were made for formal charges, and the case was prepared for court. From that moment forward, the narrative was no longer shaped by what had been seen in public, but by what had been committed to paper. By mid-December, the case had moved from the street into the courtroom. The trial of Kitty Byron opened at the Old Bailey on the 15th of December 1902. Public interest was immediate and sustained. The courtroom was filled, and press coverage reflected the attention the case had already drawn. From the outset, proceedings followed a structured presentation of facts, rather than speculation. Witnesses were called in sequence, beginning with those who had observed events at Duke Street. Madame Adrienne Led gave evidence regarding the domestic arrangement, the disturbances she had witnessed, and her decision to require the couple to separate. Testimony from others in the household supported her account, describing the atmosphere within the rooms and the changes that had preceded the final week. Attention then turned to events on King William Street. Bystanders and officials described the meeting, the brief exchange, and the actions taken immediately afterward. Medical and police evidence was presented to establish the outcome beyond dispute. The defense addressed Kitty Byron's state of mind, relying on her recorded statements and the circumstances leading up to the meeting. The judge summarized the evidence and directed the jury on the law applicable to the charge. After deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty, accompanied by a recommendation for mercy. Sentence was then formally passed by the court, concluding the trial phase of the case. The sentence did not mark the end of the case. Following the verdict, a petition was organized on Kitty Byron's behalf. It attracted widespread support, reflecting the public interest the case had generated and the circumstances that had been placed before the court. The appeal was submitted for consideration within days of the trial's conclusion. On the 23rd of December 1902, the Home Secretary intervened. After review, the original sentence was set aside and replaced with penal servitude for life. The decision was communicated formally, bringing the legal process to a close while altering its outcome. Kitty Byron was transferred into the custody of His Majesty's prison, where her confinement was recorded in official registers. Over the years that followed, her sentence was reviewed. In 1907, the term was reduced, a decision noted without public announcement or explanation beyond administrative record. 1 year later, in December 1908, Kitty Byron was released from custody. Her release was conditional. She was required to reside in a supervised reform setting and to remain under observation for a period determined by authorities. After this point, the documentation ends. No further confirmed records place her in any specific location or circumstance. She did not reappear in court proceedings, press reports, or official notices. Having passed through every stage of the system, Kitty Byron then passed from view entirely. The case concludes not with resolution, but with absence, and the silence that followed remains unbroken.